The grand hall echoed with the sound of laughter and music. It was an evening of high diplomacy, a rare moment where the most powerful people from different star systems gathered under one roof. These were not just any people. They were the barons, alien aristocrats who ruled entire planets, holding power that stretched beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Tonight, they were all here for one thing: peace talks. The room was filled with the whispers of negotiations and the promises of alliances. At the center of it all stood Corbin Arlen, a human diplomat. His mission was clear: secure peace between Earth and the alien systems that had long been at odds with humanity. He was well versed in these types of events. Diplomacy was his life. He had navigated the choppy waters of power games before, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. He had been briefed on the customs of the barons, but this was something different. Corbin adjusted his silver jacket and took a deep breath. He had met leaders of countless planets before, but tonight was different. The tension in the room wasn't just about trade agreements or military strategy. It was about something bigger. Peace was something these barons didn't give away easily, and every word spoken had weight. Then the voice of Baron Kraylock rang out, silencing the room. Kraylock was the leader of the most powerful and influential house in the galaxy, his skin dark and metallic, glimmering under the bright chandeliers. "I present to you, esteemed diplomats, a gift," Kraylock said with a wide grin. His voice was thick with smugness. The barons were known for their unique way of showing generosity. A gift wasn't just a gesture. It was a statement, a power move. Corbin raised an eyebrow. He had expected something extravagant, perhaps rare jewels or a rare artifact, the kind of objects the barons traded like currency. But Kraylock's gifts were never simple, and they often held deeper meanings. With a flourish, Kraylock stepped aside, and the doors at the far end of the hall swung open. The room fell silent as everyone turned to see what was coming. A strange, floating chair drifted into the room. On it sat a young woman, her posture rigid and straight. She looked as though she were frozen, unable to move. It took Corbin a moment to process what he was seeing. She was human, like him, but there was something unsettling about the way she was seated in that chair, like she didn't belong. "This," Kraylock said, his voice dripping with amusement, "is my daughter, Lyra." Corbin froze. His mind raced. This was the gift. A young woman bound to a stasis chair, unable to move, unable to speak in any meaningful way. She appeared paralyzed, her eyes cold, yet full of something more. But what was the point of this? The other guests in the room chuckled, and a few even snickered. Corbin stood tall, but inside, his stomach churned. This was a joke. There was no way this wasn't some sort of twisted power play. Giving a paralyzed daughter as a gift was a mockery of everything that peace talks were supposed to stand for. Lyra's eyes flicked to Corbin. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in her gaze. It was almost as though she was aware of the game that was being played, and she wasn't going to let anyone take her dignity without a fight. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. All eyes were on Corbin, waiting for his response. What could he possibly say? His role as a diplomat had never prepared him for this. He had been in tense meetings, but this was cruelty in the guise of generosity. Kraylock watched him, his grin widening, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Well," Kraylock prompted, his tone almost mocking. "Do you accept?" Corbin's mind raced. The diplomatic option was clear: refuse the gift, and it would be a direct insult to the Baron, ruining any chance for peace. But accepting it, it meant acknowledging something that wasn't just a gift, but a humiliation. A statement that humans were so inferior they could be treated as pawns in a galactic game. He stood there for a moment, trying to find the right words, when something unexpected happened. Corbin stepped forward, eyes never leaving Kraylock's. He gave a slight bow to Lyra, who stared back at him with an unreadable expression. "I accept," he said simply. The room was silent. Corbin's words hung in the air, almost daring anyone to challenge him. Lyra's eyes softened for just a moment, as though she were surprised by his calm acceptance. She didn't expect this. No one did. Kraylock seemed a bit taken aback, his smirk faltering for the first time. "I will ensure she is treated with the respect she deserves," Corbin added, his voice firm. There was no hesitation in his words. For a moment, it seemed like time stopped. The Barons had never seen anyone act this way before. Humans had always been seen as weak, easy to manipulate. Corbin had just thrown a wrench into the gears of the Baron system, and they didn't know how to react. Kraylock recovered quickly. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a sly grin once more. "A wise decision. But I must warn you, Corbin Arlen, you may find my daughter more of a burden than you think." Corbin simply nodded, not breaking his gaze. "I will bear whatever burden comes my way." With that, the crowd began to murmur, but the tension in the air was thick. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. Kraylock, though he had tried to humiliate Corbin, realized something. The diplomat wasn't like the others. Corbin wasn't intimidated by power games. He wasn't a man who could be broken by insults. Corbin turned to Lyra and gestured for her to follow him. "Shall we?" he said, his voice calm but full of purpose. Lyra, still frozen in her chair, seemed hesitant at first, but she gave a slight nod and allowed Corbin to guide her toward the exit. As they left the hall, the whispers grew louder. Everyone in the room had witnessed a moment that would be talked about for years to come. They had seen a human diplomat refuse to be humiliated by the Varens. What they didn't know, though, was that this moment would mark the beginning of something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The quiet of the hallway outside the gala hall felt like a world apart from the chaos within. Lyra's chair hummed softly, and her eyes followed Corbin with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Corbin walked beside her, his face unreadable, but his mind was already working on the next move. He knew this wouldn't be easy. The Barons were not known for their leniency, and now, by accepting Lyra, he had placed a target on both their backs. But what surprised him more than anything was the feeling he couldn't quite shake off. He had accepted Lyra as a gift not just out of obligation or diplomacy, but because there was something about her, something different, that intrigued him. Her eyes, cold and distant, seemed to hide a storm beneath the surface, something that no one in the room had noticed. Lyra wasn't just a gift. She wasn't just an object in the Baron's game. There was more to her. And Corbin would soon find out that the joke the Barons had played on him might turn out to be far more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. The journey back to Corbin's ship felt long and uncomfortable. Lyra sat in the hovering stasis chair beside Corbin, her face expressionless, her eyes staring straight ahead. Every now and then, she would glance at him, but the look she gave was almost challenging, as if daring him to speak. Corbin couldn't help but notice how still she was. It was as if the chair had become an extension of her body, a part of her that was neither alive nor dead. The quiet hum of the chair was the only sound between them. Corbin wasn't sure what to make of her. He had accepted the gift without hesitation, but now that they were alone, he had questions. His instincts told him that there was more to Lyra than met the eye. Something about her didn't sit right. She wasn't just a helpless girl, paralyzed and at the mercy of the Barons. There was something deep inside her that didn't belong to the world she was trapped in. After what felt like hours of silence, Corbin finally spoke. "Are you okay?" His voice was gentle, though he wasn't sure how much she could hear or understand. He had no idea how Lyra's condition worked. Was she conscious? Was she aware of her surroundings? Or was she lost in a haze of numbness? She didn't answer at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the empty space in front of her. Corbin thought for a moment that she might not respond at all. But then her voice came, quiet, barely above a whisper. "I'm fine," she said, though the words didn't match the coldness in her eyes. "I've been in this chair for years. A few more hours won't matter." Corbin frowned. She sounded resigned to her fate, as if the pain and frustration of her condition had long ago become a part of who she was. But something about the way she said it made him uneasy. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, only the dull acceptance of someone who had learned to live with a terrible truth. "Why did your father give you to me?" Corbin asked, hoping to understand more about the strange gift he had been given. "I don't think it's just a joke. There's something else, isn't there?" Lyra turned her head toward him, and for the first time, Corbin saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't fear or anger, but something else, something deeper. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to trust him or not. "You're right," she said, her voice growing slightly more steady. "It's not just a joke. My father, he's always had plans for me. He used me for something much darker than you know." Corbin's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. This wasn't just a story of a father trying to humiliate his daughter. There was something much more dangerous happening. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. Lyra's eyes darkened. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, staring at the control panel on the armrest of her chair. She spoke again, but her words were hesitant, as if revealing the truth was something she had avoided for a long time. "I wasn't always like this," she began. "I didn't always need this chair. I was normal. Well, as normal as someone like me could be." She let out a bitter laugh, though it was barely audible. "My father wanted me to be perfect. He didn't care about me as a person. All he cared about was power. And I had something he wanted." Corbin leaned in. "What do you mean? What did you have that he wanted?" Lyra's gaze flickered away from him, as if she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. "I have abilities," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have powers that no one can explain. Even the barons don't fully understand them. But they're there, inside me." Corbin felt a chill run down his spine. Powers. He had heard rumors of strange abilities in the galaxy, things that defied the laws of physics and biology. But he hadn't believed them, at least, not until now. "What kind of powers?" he asked, his voice tight with growing interest. "What can you do?" Lyra hesitated again. She seemed reluctant to say more, but the weight of her secret was finally too much to keep locked away. "I can manipulate energy," she said quietly. "Not just any energy, life energy. I can heal, or I can destroy. It depends on how I use it. But the barons, they were afraid of me. They thought I could be a threat. So they made me like this." She gestured to the chair that held her body captive. "They paralyzed me to keep me under control. My father was the one who ordered it." Corbin's mind was reeling. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture was still unclear. The barons had always been known for their cruelty, but this was something else entirely. They had used Lyra, a young woman, as a tool for their own power. And her own father had betrayed her. "But why?" Corbin asked. "Why keep you alive if they feared you? Why not just kill you?" Lyra's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Because my power is too valuable to destroy. They thought they could control me, use me as a weapon when they needed it, but I wasn't their puppet. Not then, and not now." Corbin's eyes narrowed. "So, that's why they gave you to me." Lyra's gaze met his, and for the first time, there was something like defiance in her eyes. "Exactly. They thought I'd be a burden. They'd wanted to test you, to see if you'd crack under the pressure. But they don't know you. They don't know you're not like the others." Corbin sat back, stunned. He was beginning to understand. The barons had sent Lyra as a challenge. They wanted to see if he could handle her, or if he would fall into their trap. If he failed, they would see it as a victory. But Corbin wasn't like other diplomats. He wasn't going to play their game. "Why didn't you tell me all of this earlier?" Corbin asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering the strength to explain herself. "I couldn't. I didn't trust you. I didn't trust anyone. My father trained me to be cautious, to protect myself at all costs. Corbin nodded, understanding. Trust wasn't easy when you had been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to care for you. It made sense that Lyra had kept her secret hidden for so long. She had been a prisoner in more ways than one. Are you able to control your powers now? Corbin asked carefully. Lyra sighed. Sometimes, but it's not easy. It's like trying to control a storm. My emotions can trigger it. If I'm angry, I can destroy everything around me. If I'm calm, I can heal. But the chair keeps me from being able to use them fully. It's like a cage. Corbin looked at the chair, then back at Lyra. He could see the pain in her eyes now, the frustration that she had hidden behind her cold exterior. She was more than just a prisoner. She was a weapon, a force of nature locked away in a fragile body. He didn't know what to say, so he simply placed a hand on her chair. I won't let them use you like this. I promise. Lyra's eyes flickered up to meet his, and for the first time, there was a spark of hope in them. You don't know what you're promising, she whispered. Corbin smiled gently. Maybe. But I know this. No one should have the power to control someone else. Not like this. As they sat in silence, the weight of what they were facing began to sink in. Lyra wasn't just a young woman caught in a terrible situation. She was a force of nature, a weapon that could change the course of history, and Corbin had just promised to help her. But as they sailed through the stars, heading into unknown territory, Corbin knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The Barons would come for them. And when they did, Lyra would have to choose: control her powers or unleash them on the galaxy. The future was uncertain, but Corbin was ready to face it, together with Lyra. The ship hummed softly as it traveled deeper into the unknown reaches of the galaxy. Corbin Arlen sat at the navigation console, staring at the stars outside. His mind raced with the events that had unfolded in the past few days. He had promised to protect Lyra, a woman with powers beyond anything he had ever imagined. And yet, even as the stars stretched out before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming. A storm he couldn't escape. The Barons didn't take kindly to being humiliated, and he had just done the one thing no one was supposed to do. He had taken Lyra from them, in front of their very eyes. They would come for them. There was no doubt about it. Lyra, sitting quietly in her chair next to him, seemed to sense his unease. Her eyes, though distant, flicked toward him. Thinking about the Barons, she asked, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it. Corbin sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah, I don't know how long we have before they send someone after us. And when they do, it won't be pretty. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything. She knew exactly how dangerous the Barons were. She had lived under their control for years. Corbin wasn't sure what he had expected when he took her in, but this was bigger than just a simple diplomatic mission. The Barons had made sure that Lyra was far from ordinary. They had wanted to keep her under control, but now that she was free, the galaxy would have to reckon with the consequences. Corbin's role in this was no longer just a peaceful mission. It had become a fight for survival. They had only just begun their journey, and already the quiet hum of the ship felt too loud. Corbin had heard rumors of the Barons' ruthlessness. He had heard stories about how they never forgave a slight, how they hunted down anyone who defied them. Now he was at the center of their wrath. A sudden, sharp alarm blared, interrupting his thoughts. His hand instinctively reached for the console as the ship shook slightly. Lyra's chair jolted, but she remained perfectly still, her eyes scanning the monitors in front of her. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice cold. "We're being tracked," Corbin replied, his fingers dancing over the buttons. His heart began to race. He had expected this, but seeing it unfold in real time was a different thing entirely. "They've already sent a ship after us." Lyra's expression didn't change, but there was a flash of something in her eyes, something sharp. She was no stranger to danger. "How long do we have?" Corbin's eyes darted to the screen. trying to make sense of the situation. A large ship was rapidly approaching. The barons didn't waste time when it came to dealing with traitors. Whoever was coming after them wasn't going to negotiate. They would simply destroy them if they had to. Not long, Corbin muttered. We've got maybe a few minutes before they catch up with us. Lyra let out a deep breath, and for a moment, Corbin thought she might be afraid. But then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. We'll be fine. Corbin glanced at her in surprise. There was something different in the way she said it. It wasn't the kind of confidence you'd expect from someone in her situation. She had been a prisoner her whole life. She had been controlled, manipulated, and used as a pawn. Yet here she was ready to face whatever came next. We can't outrun them, Corbin said. They'll catch us. And if they do, we'll be finished. They'll take you back to your father, or worse. Lyra shook her head slowly. They won't take me back, she said, her voice low, almost to herself. I won't let them. Corbin's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. His hands worked quickly over the controls, pulling up various systems, but everything seemed to be closing in on him. The Baron's ship was getting closer with every passing second, and they didn't have many options left. Can you use your powers? Corbin asked, looking over at her. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met, there was a flicker of fear in them. Not for herself, but for what might happen if she unleashed her abilities. I don't know if I can control them, she admitted. It's too risky. If I lose control, I could destroy everything. I've done it before, and I don't want to do it again. Corbin's heart pounded in his chest. He understood her hesitation. She had been through so much, and the last thing she wanted was to become the weapon that everyone feared. But they didn't have the luxury of waiting. You have to try, he said, his voice urgent. If they catch us, it'll be over for both of us. You have the power to stop them. I know you can do it. I'm not asking you to be a weapon. I'm asking you to survive. Lyra's gaze softened, just for a moment. But the storm inside her was still there. He could see it in her eyes. Her powers weren't something she had ever wanted to use. But Corbin was right. She had no other choice. The ship shook again, harder this time. The Baron's ship was almost on top of them. Lyra took a deep breath, her fingers twitching slightly against the armrest of her chair. She closed her eyes, trying to focus. Corbin watched her closely, his heart in his throat. He didn't know if she would succeed, but he knew one thing. They had to try. Suddenly, Lyra's entire body tensed, and a wave of energy radiated from her, flooding the room with a hum that made Corbin's skin crawl. He could feel it, the raw power that surged through her, both beautiful and terrifying. For a moment, he thought the ship might shake apart under the force of her abilities. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the energy flickered and died. Lyra's face was pale, her breathing labored. She had pushed herself too hard. Corbin rushed to her side. Lyra, are you okay? She nodded weakly, though her face was drained of color. I held them off. For now. Corbin's eyes widened as he glanced at the screen. The Baron's ship had pulled back. Their systems were disrupted, just for a moment, but enough to buy them some time. Lyra had done it. She had repelled their attack. But he knew it wouldn't last long. They'll regroup, Corbin said, his mind racing. This is only temporary. We need to figure out where we're going. Somewhere they can't find us. Lyra's eyes closed briefly, as though she was thinking. There's a place, she said slowly, her voice quiet but steady. A hidden planet. My father doesn't know about it. It's not on any of their charts. Corbin raised an eyebrow. Where? Lyra looked at him, her expression serious. It's called Veyron, a place I've kept secret for years. If we can make it there, we might have a chance. Corbin didn't hesitate. Set the course. Now. Lyra's fingers hovered over the controls, and the ship veered sharply in the direction she indicated. Corbin watched the stars shift outside the window as they made the jump to Veyron. The Barons might not know about it, but he had a feeling that wouldn't stop them from coming after them. The Barons had already proven how far they were willing to go to control Lyra, and now they would stop at nothing to get her back. They were no longer just running from the Barons, they were running from an entire system that saw Lyra as a threat, a weapon that could change the fate of the galaxy. Corbin knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about defying everything the Barons stood for. It was about fighting back. And they would fight until the very end. The ship lurched as it made its jump through the galaxy, the stars blurring into streaks of light outside. Corbin Arlen sat at the controls, his hands gripping the console tightly. The journey had been long, and the threat from the Barons had not disappeared. It still loomed over them. The ship's engine hummed steadily, but Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Beside him, Lyra was quiet, her face pale, her expression distant. She had used her powers earlier to disrupt the Baron's ship, but it had drained her energy, leaving her weak and exhausted. Corbin could see how much it had taken out of her. He felt a mixture of admiration and concern for her. She was incredibly strong, stronger than anyone he had ever met. But even she had limits. "We should be safe for now," Corbin muttered to himself. But even as he said it, he couldn't entirely believe it. The Barons were relentless. They would not let them slip away so easily. Lyra shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking toward him. "Do you believe that?" she asked softly. Corbin looked over at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "Do you really think we can escape?" she pressed, her voice low but steady. "The Barons won't stop until they have me back. They won't stop until they control me." Corbin hesitated before responding. "I don't think we can outrun them forever," he said carefully. "But we don't have to. We have a chance to fight back." Lyra's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if searching for something in his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Maybe," she whispered. The silence between them was thick, filled with the unspoken understanding that the road ahead was dangerous. They were running from the Barons, but they weren't just running anymore. They were actively fighting against a system that had oppressed Lyra for so long. Corbin broke the silence. "You mentioned a place, Varen, right? We're heading there." Lyra nodded, her eyes distant. "Yes, it's a secret place, far from the Baron's reach. My father doesn't know about it. I've been there before. It's a place where people like us can find refuge." Corbin raised an eyebrow. "People like us?" Lyra hesitated. "People who don't belong in the Baron's world. People who've been oppressed, or who are willing to fight against them." Corbin's curiosity piqued. "You mean a resistance?" Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something like hope in them. "Yes, a rebel alliance. They've been fighting the Barons for years, in the shadows. They're our best chance at surviving, and they'll help us stop the Barons for good." Corbin felt a spark of something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was hope. Hope that there was a way out of this nightmare. Hope that they weren't alone. "How do we find them?" Corbin asked. "How do we reach them?" Lyra turned back to the controls, her fingers moving across the panel as she entered a series of commands. "The coordinates are hidden in a secure database," she explained. "Only the leaders of the Alliance know where it is. But I have a way of accessing it." Corbin watched as Lyra worked with precision. He had no idea how she managed to keep her calm, even in the face of such uncertainty. It was a skill he admired, but also something he couldn't fully understand. As the ship made its way toward Varen, Lyra's expression grew more serious. "The Alliance is made up of all kinds of people," she said. "Some are former soldiers, others are survivors of the Baron's cruelty. But they're all united by a single goal, taking down the Barons." Corbin's mind was racing. This was it. This was the turning point. If they could make it to the Rebel Alliance, they would finally have a chance to stand up against the Barons. They wouldn't just be hiding, they would be fighting back. But there was a nagging question in the back of his mind. "Are you sure we can trust them?" After everything your father did to you, how can we know they won't betray us too? Lyra didn't look at him, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I've been to their base before. I trust them. They're not like my father. They don't care about power. They care about freedom. They care about stopping the Barons. Corbin nodded slowly, but doubt still lingered. He had seen too many betrayals in his line of work to trust anyone blindly. Still, he had no choice if they were going to survive. They needed allies. Hours passed as the ship continued its journey. The stars outside began to shift as they entered a more remote part of the galaxy. Lyra remained focused on the controls, while Corbin tried to prepare himself for what was coming. There was no going back now. The Rebel Alliance wasn't just a hope, it was their only hope. Hours later, the ship finally began its descent toward Varan. It was a small, hidden planet, located far from any major space routes. As Corbin looked out the window, he could see the dense forest canopy below, the dark, deep green of the trees stretching for miles. It was peaceful, eerily so. It was hard to believe that a group of rebels fighting the Barons could be hiding here, in such a tranquil place. This is it, Lyra said softly, her voice carrying a weight that matched the gravity of the moment. We're here. Corbin swallowed, his heart pounding. So, where do we go from here? Lyra glanced at him. We land, and then we follow the signal. The Alliance will know we're coming. They'll be ready. Corbin nodded. There was no turning back. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. They had come this far, and now they had to trust in something bigger than themselves. The ship landed smoothly, the engines whirring as the craft touched down on the soft ground of Varan. For a moment, there was silence. Corbin turned to Lyra, searching her face for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was resolve. She had made her choice, and so had he. Let's go, Corbin said, his voice steady. Lyra slowly unstrapped herself from her chair and stood, her legs shaky from being in the chair for so long. Corbin was ready to help her, but she waved him off, her expression fierce. She didn't need anyone's help. Not anymore. They made their way to the exit of the ship. As the door opened, Corbin was hit with the fresh, earthy smell of the forest outside. The air was thick with the scent of trees and damp soil. It was a strange contrast to the cold, metallic interior of the ship, but there was no time to enjoy the peace. They had a mission. Corbin looked around, his eyes scanning the thick trees that surrounded them. There were no signs of life, no sounds of movement. It felt like they were the only ones there. Then, from the shadows, figures emerged. They moved with precision, their footsteps light but purposeful. Corbin's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but before he could even reach it, one of the figures stepped forward. Corbin Arlen. The voice called out, steady and calm. We've been expecting you. Lyra stepped forward, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. This is it, the Rebel Alliance. Corbin took a deep breath, his heart pounding. They had made it, but as the figures came closer, he knew this was only the beginning. They had found refuge, but the real battle, the one that would decide the fate of the galaxy, was still ahead of them. The Alliance wasn't just a group of rebels. It was a force of change, and it was the last hope for the people who had been oppressed by the Barons for so long. Corbin was about to step into a world of danger, a world of rebellion, and he had no idea how it would end. But one thing was certain. The Barons would not go down without a fight. And neither would they. The forest around them was silent, the dense trees casting long shadows across the land. Corbin, Arlen, and Lyra stood side by side, their eyes scanning the area as the members of the Rebel Alliance led them deeper into the woods. It felt like they were walking through a dream. Everything was so still, so untouched. Lyra's eyes, though, were anything but peaceful. The weight of what they had just walked into, the Rebel Alliance, was heavy on her mind. She had been running for so long, always staying one step ahead of the Barons, always hiding, always fearing what would happen if she were ever caught. Now, here she was, in the middle of a forest on a remote planet, surrounded by people who claimed to be her allies. But there was something gnawing at her. The Barons were not people to be underestimated. They were dangerous, ruthless, and they had a way of getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. And even here, in this place of supposed safety, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Barons' eyes were still on her. As the rebels led them to a hidden camp deep within the forest, Corbin kept glancing around. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that something wasn't right. There was an unease in the air, a tension he couldn't quite explain. It was like walking into a trap without knowing it. Finally, the leader of the rebel group, Captain Nera, led them to a small clearing. A group of armed rebels stood near a makeshift camp, their faces grim. They greeted Lyra with solemn nods, but Corbin noticed that there was something off about their welcome. It was too quiet, too distant. "Welcome to our base," Nera said, her voice steady but guarded. "You're safe here." Lyra nodded, but Corbin could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure about this place, and neither was he. As Nera explained the plans for their alliance, how they would fight the Barons, how they would gather support from other systems, Corbin felt his mind wandering. Something didn't feel right. The pieces weren't adding up. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back. Later that night, as the camp settled into a quiet routine, Corbin stood outside the tent, looking up at the stars. He needed a moment to himself. Everything had happened so quickly. 1 minute, he was on a mission to help Lyra escape, and now, they were standing in the heart of a rebellion. But the Barons weren't going to give up just because they had found a place to hide. Corbin knew that better than anyone. Lyra appeared beside him, her face still tense, as though the weight of everything was bearing down on her. "I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong," Corbin said, his voice low. Lyra looked at him. "I feel it too. But what else can we do? We have to trust them. The Barons. They'll come for us. They always do." Corbin nodded but didn't feel convinced. His gut was telling him that the danger wasn't just from the Barons. It was coming from within. Someone in the camp was hiding something. The following morning, as the day broke, the rebels began preparing for their next move. They were gathering resources, setting up defenses, and making plans to spread their message to other systems. For Corbin and Lyra, it was all too much too soon. They had barely had time to catch their breath before they were plunged into the next stage of their escape. However, as Corbin walked through the camp, he noticed a familiar face, a man he had seen in the Baron's inner circle. Garrett Aslan, a former officer in the Baron's fleet, stood near the edge of the camp, speaking quietly with Captain Nera. Corbin's blood ran cold. There was no way it was a coincidence. Garrett Aslan had been one of the Baron's most trusted commanders. If he was here, it could only mean one thing. They had been betrayed. He stepped forward, his mind racing. He had to confront Nera, find out what was really going on, and warn Lyra. As he approached, he caught snippets of the conversation. "Aslan, are you sure they're here?" Nera's voice was low, almost a whisper. "They'll be arriving soon," Garrett said. "We need to be ready. We can't let them slip away again." Corbin's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard enough. Nera was working with the Barons. She was leading them straight into a trap. He turned sharply and made his way back to Lyra's tent. She had to know. They had to leave before it was too late. When he entered the tent, Lyra looked up at him, her face instantly alert. "What's wrong?" Corbin grabbed her arm gently, his voice urgent. "We need to leave. Now. Nera's been working with the Barons. This whole place is a trap." Lyra's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about? How do you know?" Corbin explained quickly, telling her about Garrett Aslan and the conversation he overheard. "They're waiting for us. The Barons will be here soon, and we'll be surrounded." Lyra's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice steady. "But we can't run either. We have to fight." Corbin didn't know what to think. He had been so sure that they could trust the rebels. But now it seemed like they had walked straight into the heart of the Baron's trap. There was no way out without a fight, but the odds weren't in their favor. Before Corbin could say anything else, a loud crash echoed through the camp. A series of blinding lights erupted in the distance, followed by the sounds of explosions. The Barons were here, just as Corbin had feared. They had fallen right into the trap. The battle begins. The rebels scrambled into action, but it was too late. The Barons' forces were closing in, their ships descending from the sky, their soldiers already making their way through the trees. Corbin and Lyra ran toward the center of the camp, where Nera and Garrett had already gathered with a handful of rebels. "You sold us out," Corbin shouted, his voice filled with anger. Nera's face twisted into a cold smile. "You were always too trusting, Corbin. Did you really think you could hide from the Barons forever?" Lyra stepped forward, her eyes flashing with fury. "Why?" she demanded. "Why betray us? We're fighting the same enemy." Nera shook her head. "The Barons are powerful, Lyra. You may think you're the key to their downfall, but the reality is that they control everything. You can't defeat them. I made my peace with that a long time ago." Garrett stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You've been nothing but a pawn in their game, Lyra. You were always meant to be used. And now you'll return to them, where you belong." Before Lyra could react, Corbin pulled her back. "We're not going back. We'll fight," he said through gritted teeth. Nera's smile widened. "Then you'll die with the rest of them." The first wave of Baron soldiers emerged from the trees, their weapons raised. The battle had begun. Corbin and Lyra fought side by side, their movements swift and coordinated. They had no choice now. There was no escape, no running. They had to stand and fight. Lyra's powers flared again as she unleashed a wave of energy, knocking several of the Baron soldiers off their feet. But it wasn't enough. For every soldier she took down, 2 more appeared in their place. The Baron's forces were overwhelming. Corbin fought with all his strength, using every bit of his training to protect Lyra. He knew they had to find a way out, but the odds were stacked against them. As the battle raged on, Corbin caught a glimpse of Nera and Garrett making their way toward the rear of the camp. They were trying to escape, to let the Barons finish what they had started. But Corbin wasn't going to let them get away. With one final push, Corbin broke through the chaos and sprinted toward Nera and Garrett. He wasn't going to let them win, not after everything they had done. But just as he reached them, a shot rang out from the shadows. Corbin felt a sharp pain in his side, and he stumbled, his vision blurring. Lyra's scream echoed through the air as she rushed to his side, but everything went dark. Everything felt like it was happening too fast. The world around Corbin Arlen spun in a dizzying blur as he struggled to stay conscious. The sharp pain in his side was all-consuming, a cruel reminder of how quickly everything had gone wrong. Lyra, her face pale with fear, knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound to try and stop the bleeding. But her efforts weren't enough. Corbin's vision was fading, the edges of his sight darkening. He could hear her voice, frantic and full of worry. "Corbin, stay with me. Don't close your eyes. You can't give up now. We need to get out of here. We can't let them win." But despite her pleas, Corbin felt his body growing weaker with every passing second. The battle raged on around them. He could hear the sounds of weapons firing, the shouts of rebels and Baron soldiers alike. The camp was under siege. But none of that mattered to Corbin at the moment. His mind was foggy, and the cold, numbing darkness was pulling at him. "Please, don't do this," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling as she held his hand. "We can still fight. You're not alone. We'll make it through this. You and me. We'll keep going." For a brief moment, Corbin's eyes flickered open, and he saw Lyra's face, the desperation in her eyes. He could feel her warmth, her strength, even though his body was telling him to give in. But something inside him, something deeper than the pain, deeper than the exhaustion, refused to give up. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. "I'm not leaving you," Corbin murmured weakly, his voice barely a whisper. The words came out broken, but Lyra's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. She leaned in closer, her hand gripping his tightly, as if holding on to that small, fragile thread of hope. For a few moments, there was only the sound of her breathing, quick and frantic, as she tried to keep him awake. But then, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them, sending both of them to the ground. Corbin groaned, his head spinning, but he could feel the world starting to shift again, as if the ground beneath them was no longer as stable as it had been before. The Baron's forces were closing in, and they had no time left. Lyra's eyes widened, and her hand reached for her weapon, but she hesitated. She wasn't going to leave Corbin. She couldn't. Not like this. In that moment, something unexpected happened. A voice, one that Corbin recognized all too well, cut through the chaos. "Lyra, get down. You really mean it, don't you?" he asked quietly. "You really want to fight with us, for the right reasons." Nara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the weight of everything she had done. "I can't undo the past, but I can make sure the future is different. I can help you. I won't make the same mistakes again." "I can't." Corbin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, and I believe you." In that moment, something shifted. The tension that had been between them for so long seemed to ease. Nara wasn't the enemy anymore. She wasn't the traitor who had betrayed them. She was an ally, someone who had seen the truth and was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. The rebels gathered around them, ready to move. It was time to take the fight to the Barons. As they made their way toward the final battle, Corbin knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. For Lyra, for Nara, and for everyone who had ever suffered under the Baron's rule. And this time, they were ready. Before either of them could react, a figure appeared out of the smoke and debris of the battlefield. It was Nara, the same rebel leader who had once betrayed them to the Barons. But now, Nara was standing before them, her face grim, her expression hard but resolute. The sight of her was a shock in itself. Corbin had never imagined he'd see her again after everything that had happened. "You shouldn't be here," Lyra said, her voice full of disbelief. "You were with the Barons. You betrayed us." Nara's face was cold, her gaze unwavering. "I know. I made a mistake. But I've seen the truth now. The Barons, they're monsters, and I can't be part of their game anymore. I'll do whatever it takes to help you both. Just trust me." Corbin struggled to sit up, the pain in his side overwhelming, but he managed to meet Nara's eyes. "Why should we trust you, after everything you've done?" Nara's expression softened, and she knelt down beside them. "Because I know what it feels like to be used. I know what it feels like to be betrayed. I made choices I regret, but I'm trying to make things right. I can't undo the past, but I can help you fight back. I owe it to you both." Corbin couldn't believe what he was hearing. Nara, the same woman who had led them into a trap, was now claiming she wanted to help. Was this some kind of trick, or had she really changed? Before he could speak, Lyra cut in, her voice firm but tinged with a hint of disbelief. "If you're serious, then prove it. Help us get out of here." Nara nodded. "I will. I'll get you both to safety. I know a way out of this camp, a hidden path that the Barons don't know about." Without waiting for a response, Nara helped Lyra support Corbin as they staggered to their feet. The battle was still raging, but the chaos around them seemed to fade into the background as Nara guided them through the camp. The sounds of gunfire and explosions were muffled now, replaced by the sound of their hurried footsteps as they moved toward a dense thicket of trees. As they made their way through the woods, Nara led them to a hidden entrance in the side of a mountain. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but it provided the perfect cover. Once inside, they paused to catch their breath, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Lyra helped Corbin sit against the wall, his breathing shallow but steady. She looked at Nera, still unsure whether she could fully trust her. But for now, they had no other choice. The Barrens were close, and they needed all the help they could get. "So, what now?" Corbin asked, his voice hoarse but determined. "What's your plan?" Nera looked at them, her face hardening with resolve. "Now we fight. We need to take the fight to the Barrens. They can't control everything forever. I've already sent word to the rest of the rebels. We'll strike back. Together." Lyra's eyes were full of uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something else too, a spark of hope. Maybe this was their chance. Maybe Nera had really turned a new leaf, and maybe, just maybe, they could take down the Barrens once and for all. "Are you sure we can do this?" Lyra asked quietly, her voice full of doubt. "The Barrens have so much power. Can we really fight them?" Nera's gaze was unwavering. "We have something they don't. We have the will to fight for what's right. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone the Barrens have crushed, for every person they've used and discarded. And that, Lyra, is what will make the difference." Corbin, despite the pain, managed to smile. There was something about Nera's words that resonated with him. She was right. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the future of everyone the Barrens had oppressed. And if they didn't fight, who would? The redemption. Over the next few days, Nera worked with Corbin, Lyra, and the rest of the rebel forces to prepare for their next move. The Barrens, though powerful, were not invincible. Their soldiers were spread thin, and there were enough cracks in their empire for the rebels to exploit. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. For the first time in a long while, Corbin felt a sense of purpose. They weren't just running anymore. They had a plan. They had hope. But there was still the question of Nera. Could they truly trust her? She had been with the Barrens, after all. She had played a role in Lyra's torment. But as the days passed, Corbin began to see something different in her. She wasn't the same woman who had betrayed them. She had changed. She had seen the error of her ways. And now she was willing to fight alongside them, even if it meant risking her life. One night, as they prepared to leave the base and launch their first strike against the Barrens, Corbin found Nera standing alone outside. The stars above were bright, but the weight of the upcoming battle hung heavy in the air. He walked over to her, his footsteps soft on the grass.